Yeah. What about asking them to prepare? Do you ask the people you're going to assess to prepare something in advance? Like, do they need perhaps to follow the SAMM fundamentals training? Is there any requirement, or is the good idea even to ask them to prepare in advance, or you just go in there, have a conversation, and if necessary, you provide explanation of what each activity or certain activity means, and how is it structured in a SAMM model, or what the best practices are? Anyone can jump in.
Yeah. Well, I already mentioned, I think, that I start my sessions, or at least a single SAMM assessment, I do start with a little bit of training. Once we have done an initial SAMM assessment, we're working a roadmap, or with companies that have a little bit, or organizations that have already, let's say, some established maturity, then I do point them to the SAMM fundamentals course for the security champions, or for the key stakeholders of the process. And that's really when they are going to take ownership of the process themselves. Then they benefit very much from like knowing all of the model. But in general, I just give them enough basic to know what the scope is, know what we're talking about, and go further. But I'm always open to questions. So again, we're having this conversation. So sometimes questions flow my way, and I give some explanations on the let's say the details of how it's being done, and I try to keep it at that. So there's no prerequisites on training. What I do ask upfront is like documentation, and as mentioned, I think before, some architecture documentation, acronyms if they have them, organigram, organizational structure, stuff that helps me orient.
Gotcha. Rob?
Yeah, the funny thing is when you, I wonder what your experience is with this, Maxime. When you request documentation in advance and then you do an interview, people are often agitated if you're asking things that were in the documentation. So this is something I've learned sort of important to manage. If people send things in advance, mention that you use this as a reference, not that you'll study everything and ask the remaining things. But it's good to ask things. Okay.
For me, I do make it clear that, hey, for me, just to be able to ask the right questions and explain it like this, if I go unprepared in an assessment of your team, and your team, in essence, is building embedded devices, but I go with, let's say, the cloud scope, we're going to start off on the wrong foot. And it will take me a while to reorient and understand, like, oh, this is what you're actually doing. If you provide me upfront with the architecture documentation and perhaps a little bit more contextual info, I'm able to speak your language, and everyone can go home earlier. That's basically the incentive.
Yeah.
And I do mention them that I'm not going to like hold them. Any documentation is fine, whatever they send me. I'm not asking for evidences.
I see. So you're making clear that you're using the documentation for orientation, right?
Correct.
Yeah. The thing is that in order to prepare clients, we don't ask them to do any training. We also never send them the exact questions or refer them to the sheet, for example. Neither do we tell them beforehand that we'll be using SAMM, because they can look up the sheet. It's not a secret, but you get better answers if you surprise people. Because what can happen, and we've seen this, if you send all the questions in advance, they're going to talk about it in the team, and people in the team are going to influence the answers. The person responsible for the threat modeling is going to say, no, we definitely do this. Answer yes here. It's creating noise. And that noise is less if you surprise people with the actual questions, but you want to orient. So you want to get some documentation beforehand, preferably. And you want to have the right people at the table, which means that it's necessary to send them a list of topics that you're going to talk about, at least. Not the questions, but the topics. We want somebody who can tell us about these things and then surprise them with the actual questions.